Hey everyone, glad you could join with me this week as I talk about some things that God uses to grow our faith. This past Sunday I preached a sermon about how God has supplied everything that we need for life and godliness. But then on the other hand, Peter goes on in that passage and tells us that we are to make every effort to add to our faith. And so God has provided everything that we need, and we're to put forth effort in that. And I said that maturation requires our cooperation. And this week, I just want to talk about 5 things that God uses to grow our faith. These are not original with me. Andy Stanley, a few years ago, came up with these 5 things after he was talking to different people about how they were growing in their faith, and he discovered that it's 5 things that God uses: practical teaching, private disciplines, personal ministry, providential relationships, and pivotal circumstances. And so this week I just want to walk through each of those and how God uses them to grow our faith, and how we can join God, we can cooperate with God in what He's seeking to do in our lives. The first one is practical teaching. In Matthew chapter 7, it's the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus has been talking about some really practical things for people about how they should live and act and think and respond in the world around them. And he says this at the end. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts upon them may be compared to a wise man who built his house upon the rock." And Jesus then tells the parable of the wise man and the foolish man. He says the wise person listens to the practical teaching and then puts it into practice. He says the foolish man is just like the wise man, hears the teaching, however, doesn't put it into practice. And then at the end, it says this: the result was that when Jesus had finished these words, the multitudes were amazed at his teaching. For he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. And you can read through all the Gospels and you're going to see that Jesus' teaching was much different, because Jesus taught for a response. Now, he didn't just tell what was true, he explained what we were to do. And that's so important in my life and your life. We say here at Hillside all the time that it's not that we need more information, but what we are seeking is transformation. And I remember the very first time this hit home with me was when I was in college. And I grew up in a church as a kid, and grew up in a church where I had a pastor who had a PhD and taught at one of the local colleges and did very in-depth studies on God's Word. But I remember leaving church and wondering, who cares, or so what? And then when I went to college, I had started attending a church with a pastor who maybe had a Bible college degree. And in his sermons, as he would come to the end of his sermons, he would always say this. He says, "Because this is true, this is what I want you to do." And his sermons were life-changing in my life, because now he gave me something to do because of what was true. And I remember a few years ago, I taught math class for 7th graders. And I remember the 7th graders always asking, why do we need to know this? This doesn't seem to matter. How am I ever going to use this in my life? And what they were saying is, hey, you're giving us all this information, but how does it lead to transformation? And my fear is that there is a lot of Christians who are filling their head with a lot of information, but it's not leading to any transformation. Listen, I realize that if you ever listen to any of my sermons, I may not be the most, what you would consider quote unquote deep preacher in the world. Because I just want you to take what is true and then put it into practice. One of the questions I always ask myself as I'm preparing for a sermon is, how does this apply to our lives? Because this is true, what should we do? And I guarantee that if you will begin to intake practical teaching in your life, your faith is going to grow as you begin to follow Jesus in what He's asking you to do.